And good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's installment of Community for Justice from the College Community Partnership for Racial Justice. We are hosted for this forum tonight by Hamilton College and on the air by WPNY. We thank both of them very much for hosting us on this program. Our partnerships project on racial justice is a multi-phase project. We have organized this webinar, which will be presented weekly through mid-November, to educate all of us on many issues involving the challenges of racism in this Mohawk Valley of ours, and to seek your input. We have world-class experts on these topics from our colleges and universities locally and from our community. We have commissioned a poll as well by the Zogby Strategies, which is currently being analyzed and compared to national research on our college campuses. We're also working with the Community Foundation and the United Way to get input from you on how you can show your responses to the poll that was done by the Zogby Group. And let the responses and let the community leaders of our communities in every town and village and city in Oneida and Herkimer counties know how you feel about the issues of racism in the criminal justice system. You can sign in to the 211 poll and answer the questions on the poll yourself on communityforjustice.org, our website. All of this information from the poll, from the 211, from the webinar, and so forth will be forwarded to our community leaders in Oneida and Herkimer counties by January. Our counties, cities, towns, and villages, if they have police agencies, are being required by law to submit plans on racial justice to the state of New York by April 1st. So you can be performing a real public service by listening in and by responding. And please tell your friends to join us as well. I want to thank the many institutions that make up our college community partnership: Hamilton College, Utica College, SUNY Poly, MVCC, Herkimer College, Pratt Institute, the Community Foundation of Oneida and Herkimer counties, the United Way of the Mohawk Valley Frontiers, and many local businesses and individuals who have joined us for what we hope will be an open, balanced, constructive discussion leading to real results. You can be a part of this whole webinar and submit questions to our panelists on each and every Wednesday from 7 till 8:30 by joining us through our website, Community for Justice, that's the numeral 4, communityforjustice.org. Or you can watch our speakers' presentations from 7 to 8 p.m. each Wednesday here on WPNY. So we thank you very much to all of you for taking part in this webinar session tonight. Tonight's topic is, what is systemic or institutional racism? A true understanding of what we're talking about when we use those terms is essential to all of the rest of the discussions of this webinar series, including a program that I will be presenting in a few weeks on justice in the courts. So I want to begin now and introduce our speakers who will be speaking to us tonight on what is institutional or systemic racism. We have Dr. Anthony Baird of Utica College, and you'll see their pictures right now on the screen, so I'll ask them if they would just raise their hand and you can know now who is who. Dr. Anthony Baird of Utica College, Dr. Mark Montgomery of SUNY Poly, Professor Todd Franklin of Hamilton College, and Professor Ronni Tichenor of SUNY Poly. So we want to begin now, please, with Dr. Baird.
Thank you, Ralph. Good evening, and thank you for the opportunity to join you to shed some light on what I have deemed a very weighty and dense topic. It is neither my scholarship nor is it my education. However, it remains a topic of which I paid attention to as a man of color, a Black man, an African-American man in this society. Moreover, it continues to be my burden and the burden of many who are of my family and who are extensions of me, my brothers, my sisters, my cousins, my nieces and nephews, and my friends, and my students. I can go a step further to refer to members of my community who have consciously or unconsciously accepted their humanity with construct identity, labels, or categories such as Black or white. These constructs of color means different things to different people. Some people are proud and confident while others are not so much. They're confused, ambivalent, and dare I go far to say traumatized, and are left staged and left with identity and role confusion. As human beings, we all need our identity, as it gives us sense of self, which helps with self-concept, self-esteem, and self-efficacy, or self-confidence. How we see ourselves is important to who we are amongst others in our communities and our larger society. It makes us self-aware. We all have particular images of ourselves. Some of us have a better image of ourselves than others. Some of us have beliefs about the kind of person we are and who we are to become. It appears to me that in our future, in our culture, the American culture, possessing a strong sense of identity seems to be desirable, something that brings comfort and security as we pursue our daily lives. A strong sense of self-identifications help us to make decisions and to know how to conduct ourselves and to perform as a functional contributing member of our society. We're constantly faced with complex decisions and circumstances, and the need to harken back to a strong heritage, our ancestry, our roots, and those core values that govern who we are as people. It is reasonable to conclude that identity relates to self, to the person, to the individual, to the ethos, how you are and who you are. Yet, in our effort to define self-identity, we seem to call upon different kinds of labels based on sex, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, our abilities, socioeconomic status, nationality, religion, among others, and their intersectionalities. Now imagine if your name or how you are categorized, to which your social identification perpetually changes from its national origin. For example, you were once called African, Negro, colored, Black, Black American, Afro-American, African American, people of color, Caribbean American, Native American, Indigenous, Native American, Hispanic American, Latin American, or Afro-Latino, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Dominican American, and the list goes on. Names goes on and on and on. As humans, we work through and struggle to find our identity, be it personal, social, political, racial, or ethnic identity. Racial ethnic identity confusion is a result of institutional and structural racism and the legacy of slavery. Black Americans or African Americans or people of color have been labeled and categorized by external entities for centuries. The concept of race or racial identification has had an historic, controversial, contentious impact on the American society. And it has manifested in a number of ways throughout society in the forms of racial inequality and police brutality against Blacks and African Americans. We have come a long way in our journey as a people, and yet we have ways to go. We are still grappling with terminologies such as racism, systemic and institutional racism, or even structural racism. What is racism? Charles Page pointed out that racism is a sensitive word. Americans often avoid mentioning it, even when it is relevant. It is a sensitive word because it exposes so much, instructionally and personally. Page contends that it is the Rorschach word, a linguistic ink blot test. How you define it reveals something important about you, how you see the world, and how you see yourself in place of it. On the other hand, Cornel West posited that most of us remain trapped in the narrow framework of the dominant liberal and conservative views of race in America, which, with its worn-out vocabulary, leaves us intellectually debilitated, morally disempowered, and personally depressed. He further contends that a candid examination of race matters take us to that core of the crisis of American democracy, and the degree or extent to which race matters in the plight and predicament of fellow citizens is a crucial measure of whether we can keep alive the best of this democratic experiment we call America. Folks, what is institutional, systematic, or systemic racism? Institutional racism occurs within and between institutions. Institutional racism is derogatory treatment, unfair policies and inequities, inequitable opportunities and impacts based on race, produced and perpetuated by institutions, schools, mass media, etc. Individuals within institutions take on the power of the institution when they act in ways that advantages and disadvantages people based on their race. What is structural racism? Structural racism lies underneath, all around and across society. It encompasses one, history, which lies underneath the surface, providing the foundation for white supremacy in this country. Two, culture, which exists all around our everyday lives, providing the moralization and the replication of racism. And three, interconnected institutions and policies, the key relationships and rules across society, providing legitimacy and reinforcement to maintain and perpetuate racism. Examples include racist history, dominant culture representation, popular myths, and compounded and chronic inequalities. Efforts to dismantle structures of slavery are evident in some of our past practices, whereas we have come a long way from Virginia, 1619, 1865 Emancipation Proclamation, Reconstruction Amendment Acts of 1867, 13, 14, and 15, which were intended to ensure equality for the previously enslaved. It is in these three amendments that gave clear indication that formed the inceptions of slaves being brought and sold into slavery upon entry into the New World. The enslaved had no rights. The law prior to 1865 rendered them less than, inferior, and subhuman. It was the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery in the United States, whereas the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1868, granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former slaves, and guaranteed all citizens equal protection of the law. Whereas the 15th Amendment reads, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, previous conditions of servitude. The 15th Amendment guaranteed African American women and men the right to vote. The right to vote. It was ratified on February 3rd, 1870, as the third and last of the Reconstruction Amendments. Then there were Jim Crow segregation laws, separate but unequal, ran from 1877 to 1950. Next, we have Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, Topeka, Kansas, school desegregation. Up next is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and prohibited discrimination in public accommodations and federally funded programs. Those were the laws that attempted to right a serious wrong in America's history. What were the wrongs, you might ask? Well, the infamous Willie Lynch letter, The Making of a Slave, gives some insight concerning the brutal and inhumane psychology behind the African slave trade. The materialistic viewpoint of Southern plantation owners that slavery was a business and the victims of chattel slavery were merely pawns in an economic game of debauchery, cross-breeding, interracial rape, and mental conditioning of a Negroid race they considered subhuman. There was a culture of slave trading that occurred before the English and the Spanish gave total control of the trading routes. What is also equally important is the intentional nature of the European economic, political, and cultural climate that influenced the slave trade. Within time scale of African history, it was a relatively short period, a mere 1.5 century. From the most intensive phase of the Atlantic slave trade to the advent of European administration and dominance. Long before that, the slave coast had been charted by the Portuguese and the people off the area west of Benin, between the Volta River and Lagos. European traders traced and tracked a cultural history which linked them with the earliest Euroa settlement to the north and eastern borders of Africa. There were considerable debates during the colonial periods in the United States and the late 1700s. The attention of the national government was mainly directed to slavery and the rising number of slaves trade and imported into the South. The first debate was held in Congress in 1789 on the question of whether tax should be paid on an imported slave. During the debate on the Slavery Duty Bill, which was introduced by Mr. Claremont, Parker, Virginia, he moved that on May 13th, 1789, a tax of $10 per capita be laid on slaves that were imported. From 1789 to 1989, exactly 200 years to the year, November 20th, 1989, of which I am referencing, a bill. The bill is H.R. 3745 IH, 101 First Contrast. First session was introduced to the Committee on the Judiciary to acknowledge the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery in the United States and the 13 American colonies between 1619 and 1865, and to establish a commission to examine the institution of slavery, subsequent de jure and de facto racial economic discrimination against African Americans, and the impact of these forces on living African Americans, to make recommendations to the Congress on appropriate remedies and for other purposes, be it enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America. In Congress, it was assembled. The bill was cited as the Commission to Study Reparation Proposals for African Americans Act. The finding and the purpose indicates the Congress finds that approximately 4 million Africans and their descendants were enslaved in the United States, and the colonies that became the United States from 1619 to 1865, the institution of slavery was constitutionally and statutorily sanctioned by the government of the United States from 1789 through 1865, The slavery that flourished in the United States constituted an immoral and inhumane deprivation of African lives, liberty, African citizenship rights, and cultural heritage, and denied them the fruits of their labor. Sufficient inquiry has not been made into the effects of the institution of slavery on living African Americans and the society in America's United States. The purpose of this act is to establish a commission to examine the institution of slavery, which existed from 1619 to 1865 within the United States and the colonies that became the United States, including the extent to which the federal and state governments constitutionally and statutorily supported the institutionalization of slavery, examine de jure and de facto discrimination against free slaves and their descendants from the end of the Civil War, to the present, including economic, political, and social discrimination. Examine the lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery and the discrimination described in the paragraphs above on living African Americans and our society of America today. The purpose was to recommend appropriate ways to educate the American public of the Commission's findings, to recommend appropriate remedies in consideration of the Commission's findings on the matters described above. There is established the Commission studied reparation proposal for African Americans, the duties, examined federal and state laws that discriminated against freed African slaves and their descendants during the period between the end of the Civil War and the present, examine other forms of discrimination in the public and private sectors against freed African slaves and their descendants during the period between the end of the Civil War and the present, examine the lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery and the matters described in the paragraphs above, and living African Americans in the society of America today. Recommend appropriate ways to educate the public of the Commission findings. See, in making such recommendations, the Commission shall address, among other issues, the following questions. Whether government of the United States should offer a formal apology on behalf of the people of the United States for the perpetration of gross human rights violation on African slaves and their descendants, whether African Americans will suffer from the lingering effects of the matters described above. We know that they're suffering today. Whether in consideration of the commission's findings, any form of compensation to the descendants of African slaves is warranted. You see, both the Willie Lynch letters, the making of a slave, and the H.R. 3745 bill introduced to Congress in 1989 are concrete accounts and recognition of the institutionalization of racial inequity through formal United States governmental proceedings. Drawing on the works of W.E.B. Du Bois, The Suppression of the African Slave Trade to America, 1838-1870, and Slavery in the United States, Person or Property, by Paul Finkelman. He shed light on the thinking and the formation of systems of oppression that led to structural institutional slavery in America. The law of slavery and America's slave laws. Unlike the New World settlers, English had neither a law of slavery nor a tradition of slavery. The English who arrived in Jamestown in 1607 came from a place where the legal institution of slavery was a relic of the past. Moreover, when the English came to Virginia, they saw themselves as potential liberators of the Indians and the slaves who were being dominated by the Spanish. What I would like to do now is jump down to where we look at the manifestation of structural and institutional slavery and its vestiges in key sectors of our society to understand the 400 plus years impact slavery has had on America and its country, not just the once colonized, but rather any benefactors of colonization. We can account for the disparities in our education systems, healthcare system, labor practices, and massive incarcerations in our prison systems. Unemployment for Blacks is 16.7%. For whites is 14.2%. Retirement for Blacks participating in a 401k is 36%. For whites is 60%. This is an important one. Wealth gap in 2016, the median wealth by household, 171,000 represented what the white households had, and 17,100 represented the Black household. Rates of denial mortgages. Black Americans were denied at 27%, while white Americans were denied at 11%. What I'm saying to you, ladies and gentlemen, you will find throughout our various systems the discrepancies and disparities that institutional racism and structural and systemic racism has caused. I leave you with this quote. In order for us, Black and white, to desthral ourselves from the harsh slave masters' mindset, racism, bigotry, prejudice, and hate, we must unearth our buried past history. We must look at the causal and the causal relationships between the behavioral outcome of slavery and its antecedent. Racism can only end if we deal with the policies and institutional barriers that perpetuated and preserved the inequalities, the economic, educational, judicial, and social injustices that we still see all around us today. With renewed robustness, we call on members of our communities to join others in advocating and promoting policies at all levels that will combat racism and its effect in our civic and social institutions. Thank you very much.
Not sure that got heard. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Baird. I appreciate very much those comments and that instruction. We want to turn now, please, to Dr. Mark Montgomery of SUNY Poly.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for attending tonight's event. Dr. Baird, thank you for those really inspiring words. Dr. Baird talked about comfort, security, and becoming a functioning contributor to one's society. Sounds easy on face, sounds easy in theory. But in order to make positive social change in relation to things like structural and systemic racism, we have to at first acknowledge what that does. Racism, to its very, very essence, strips people to the very core of their dignity. It also produces a process that becomes insidious over time and results with a population of people through no fault of their own who feel like they don't matter. Dr. Baird also started to allude to potential solutions and avenues to turn this ship around. It's already hit the rocks, but the ship is not sinking to the point where we cannot save it. Part of the process of moving the needle in relation to structural and systemic racism, I'm going to argue, is through the outcomes that need to be sought. We need to have the conversations which talk about methodological approaches, which have empowerment as a cornerstone and empowerment as an outcome, which benefits us all. I'm going to argue that when we have conversations about racism, we have to keep an eye on those who are consequential, who are suffering. Part of the process is to get people to rise and to be in the room, to be able to have what we call courageous conversations. Courageous conversations yield fruit that encourages people to stand and feel better about themselves and their contributions to a system and a process which is clearly unequitable, that is concerning, that is powerful, and that is painful. We have to take a look at our policies because the policies simply cannot be changed unless they are understood. You have to be in the room to understand the processes. The processes cannot be valued in the transcending of those policies unless they are respected and accepted, especially by those who perceive they are the consequences of said policies versus part of the process which created them. We have to consistently take a look at countering racism. Why? Because a lot of times people who are in the room when it comes to policy don't involve the voices that need to be raised. We have a tendency to talk about diversity, especially in relation to systemic and institutional racism. That's a very broad statement. At the same time, we also have to take the time to have conversations that rise up to the level that are meaningful and respected by those who develop the policies. This is crucial and this is essential. At the same time, we have to remember what is coming after us. Another generation of people who are asking questions, even more so today. Where are we going in terms of these two insidious processes? Is there hope? Is there faith? Or are we going to continue to head toward the rocks and take on water? With conversations like tonight and processes like we have been able to create, and I'm very thankful to have been a part of, the solutions are clear. To get together as one, to remember from where we've come, celebrate that which makes us unique, and at the same time keep in check that which we perceive makes us special. Countries are usually built on the backs of some. We need to take the time to acknowledge that. We also take the time to honor that. There are people in this country and there are people in this world who simply do not understand why they are different. The Statue of Liberty says, "Bring me your poor and those yearning to be free." People are asking the same question today. We are yearning to be free. Become part of the process. Become part of positive social change so we can turn the ship of institutional and systemic racism heading in the right direction. And we need to do so collectively, with courage, with respect, with faith, and with hope that is laced with my favorite word, realistic. Thank you.
I want to thank Dr. Montgomery very much for those comments. And before we turn to our next speaker, a couple of quick points. Number one, all who are on the internet with us, feel free to go to the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen and type in questions. We will take those questions now, prepare them, and then present them to the speakers when the initial presentations are done. So we thank you for adding your questions or comments that we can share. Second, just to let you know, at 7:55, we're going to have a very special musical interlude, if you will, a special musical contribution from one of our own very own favorite world experts in music, Doc Woods of Hamilton College. So be ready for that. It's going to be a real treat. We're going to go now to Professor Todd Franklin of Hamilton College. Please, Professor Franklin.
Whoops, I believe I need video. Start your video, okay. Are we there? Good evening. When dealing with systemic racism, it's important to realize that often the most valuable insights are methods. This being the case, what I'd like to briefly stress in tandem with the insights shared by Dr. Baird is the importance of methods. As a critical race theorist, the method I follow is threefold. First, the task is to create awareness. Second, the task is to provide insight and analysis. And third, the task is to promote action. In keeping with this method, I'd point out that the operations of systemic racism are often routine. This happens and that happens, but we don't always put the pieces together. More often than not, we focus on the problematic actions of various people and fail to pay adequate attention to problematic patterns. These patterns are what we're talking about when we're talking about systemic racism. What is an unfortunate and all too clear example of systemic racism is the killing of Breonna Taylor. What happened to Miss Taylor calls attention to a very problematic and an all too deadly pattern: the use of no-knock warrants. So let's start with awareness. No-knock warrants emerged in the 1980s as part of this nation's so-called war on drugs, and they are still in use in many places as part of drug-related cases. One of the main reasons offered as justification for them is that they allow the police to catch people by surprise and prevent the destruction of drug-related evidence. Now, as a side note, it also allows the police to seize any money present that may presumably be associated with drug activity. Now let's turn to a bit of analysis. No-knock warrants are disproportionately used in relation to people of color and far too often result in the needless taking of Black and brown lives. Let me repeat that. No-knock warrants are disproportionately used in relation to people of color and far too often result in the needless taking of Black and brown lives. Around 20,000 such warrants are executed per year, and 61% of the people targeted are Black and brown, despite the fact that Black and brown people make up less than 30% of the population. Additionally, the police only actually find drugs as a result of these raids about 35% of the time. 65% of the time, there are no drugs that are found. How can we justify risking human life for the sake of evidence that the police only find about 35% of the time? So finally, let me promote action. I doubt no-knock warrants are executed in New Hartford, and they shouldn't be executed in Utica or anywhere else for that matter. Currently, however, such warrants are still legal in the state of New York. So tonight, I'm challenging all fellow New Yorkers to take action and to raise issue with their elected officials and call on them to enact legislation that bans this dangerous practice that disproportionately harms and kills Black and brown people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Franklin. I want to turn now, please, to Professor Ronni Tichenor of SUNY Poly.
It's telling me I can't start my video because the host has stopped it. But I would like to say that I'm very excited to be here this evening and be part of this panel. Is there a way to get the video to start? Okay, there we go. Perfect, thank you so much. I'm a sociologist by training, and so what I would like to do tonight is to bring some of the sociological evidence to bear on the discussion of systematic and institutional racism. And one of the things I think is really important for people who have not spent a lot of time with these issues and thinking about these issues, don't know a lot of the research that's out there, is that it's very easy to look at some of the unequal outcomes that Dr. Baird talked about in the beginning, the inequities in things like housing and healthcare and education. And oftentimes I see this where people will conflate race and class. They'll say, well, the reason there's disparity in outcomes in education or in healthcare is because Black and brown people in particular are disproportionately likely to be poor vis-a-vis their numbers in the population. And we actually have ways to sort of tease those things out and separate those things out. And what we see is that race does have an additional impact in addition to anything we might talk about in terms of social class. And we can see this from the micro level to the macro level. And again, I just like to throw a few things out there for us to be thinking about this evening as we just to highlight the scope. What we mean by systemic racism is that it touches everything. So at the macro level, we know that people have disparities in health outcomes, as Dr. Baird already highlighted. But at the micro level, we can see how these things play out. So there's research that was published just in 2018 that looked at EMTs and the extent to which they decide to administer pain medicine to people that they meet that are, traumatized in the moment. And we see that they're 40% less likely to give pain medication to Black victims of some kind of accident than whites. And that the reasoning behind this is that it plays into stereotypes that we see in our culture about Black folks, that they are medication seekers, they must be on drugs, or they have really high pain tolerance so they don't need it. And that leads to disproportionate outcomes, especially in terms of suffering. At the macro level, we see policy decisions that are made about where to locate entities that are polluters. We know that they're most likely to be put into poor communities if you're talking about things like an industrial polluting enterprise or a trash incinerator or landfill, but it's not just poor communities, it is poor communities of color. If you look at the data. So it's a specific targeting of communities of color for these extra pollutants, which of course lead to higher rates of cancer, higher rates of asthma, those kinds of things. But probably one of the most insidious policies, and tying to the history that Dr. Baird was talking about, is the inequitable outcomes that have arisen from housing and how housing has been handled in this country. It's not just about discrimination and individual realtors or lenders deciding they don't want to lend to families of color to move into particular neighborhoods that maybe have been predominantly white, but the policies of our own federal government. When the Federal Housing Authority was first enacted in the 1930s to help people buy homes, it explicitly was for whites only. And the reason, and we can talk, there's a long history of housing policies and the outcomes of that, unequal educational outcomes and so on. But one of the things that people don't recognize often in this conversation is that home ownership has been the historical way in which families have transferred wealth. from generation to generation, because people buy homes, they pay them off, and when they die, they can leave them to their children or grandchildren. They can mortgage them to help pay for education, college education for their children. And so it's been a way for white families in particular to have access to much greater wealth than Black families. And even if you look, middle-class families, you can see there's a study published in the 1990s that showed that the wealth gap between white middle-class and Black middle-class families, there's a four-fold difference in the wealth gap. And much of that is driven by not having access to mortgages and being able to buy homes, or the access they do have to mortgages. Families of color are often at higher rates. There's much more predatory lending practices. So I could go on, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the breadth of the kinds of things that we're talking about when we talk about systemic racism, and the magnitude and breadth of the inequalities that can result from them. So perhaps we can chew on some of these a little bit more in our Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tichenor. We have time now for all to add their questions and comments, and please do. We're getting a number of questions in already, and I'm going to start to relay some of those questions to our speakers so that they can respond. The first question I have starts with Dr. Baird's opening comments about people's self-identity, sense of self-identity, and how that has been impacted by our history in such an unfortunate way. A question was asked here: what do you do if your identity, because of systemic racism, you grow up, if you will, with an identity that the culture you're in is not yours? You don't own any of this culture. This culture was created by others, for others, and is not really one where you are necessarily welcome. Is that a fair question to ask? And I'll throw it open to Dr. Baird or to any of our panelists.
So I'll take it. It is a fair question, but in this case, it is something that we grapple with, we struggle with. The extent to which we're dealing with the issue and it's top of mind, one, you can decide, I don't know the extent to which because it is a trauma. You can seek therapy, you could go through hypnosis, and you can work through some type of meditation. But it also makes sense to do a self-search, get back to ancestry, find your roots and find your connectivity from where you come. And you might find through that journey, there are aspects of who you are that you appreciate. And as you grow and mature, that mature intelligence that you get through that process allows you to come to that place of satiety or satisfaction about who it is and who you are. But I think we're always in that quest to find ourselves, our true selves. I don't think we ever hold on to it for any long period of time, because as we grow, we evolve. And I think we're always going to be on that journey. The idea that identity and racism and institutional systemic racism pervades or prevents us from really owning who we are, our heritage, it is in fact the danger, is in fact the pain that we are dealing with in the society today. But I think until we come to terms with what happened to such a people, how we find forgiveness and reconciliation, is only then can we begin to embrace our new steps forward.
Thank you so much. Anyone else want to jump in? By the way, Dr. Baird, can you unmute your video, put your video back on? We can't see you. Put your camera on. Thank you. Okay, great.
Sorry about that.
It's quite all right. We could hear you, and that's really the most important. Anyone else? Or else I'm going to go to the next. Question was asked: how do we distinguish between systemic racism or just coincidence or even paranoia? Should a policy that we otherwise agree with be rejected if we discover that it has consequences that affect disproportionately a certain race, even if we agree with the policy?
Well, my response would be an unequivocal yes to that, because, and that really is a value statement. For me, I have a strong commitment to social justice. And I think that if a policy is treating anyone inequitably, then you have to re-examine the policy. It may not mean you throw the policy out entirely. And sometimes policies are created and they have unintended consequences, which is why Congress constantly rewrites the laws. So I would say it would need a sharp examination, but it definitely should not continue the way it is if someone's being harmed by it.
Thank you.
I'm always cautious of any policy that is not written by the people, but is for the people. I'm always concerned about the outcomes on people who are going to be impacted by rules, policies, or any kind of process. So I think that's what I'll add to that. I'm always concerned about something that doesn't consult, involve, or consider the impacts of people and process that it is intended to change, modify, or to suppress. Always a flag for me.
Can anyone talk to the ways in which, another question here, a misunderstanding, if you will, or a lack of recognition, or whatever you want to call it, which could be innocent or not, that can be debated or can vary depending on the circumstances. But a lack of understanding of where someone of color may be coming from when confronting a legal situation, where a police officer, let's say, who is confronting someone of color, but doesn't understand the identity questions that Dr. Baird referenced, for example, doesn't understand or recognize those, and how does that impact the encounter? Or I could say the same thing in the courts.
I didn't get a chance to chime in on the last one. I think I was a little bit slow on the unmuting of the mic. But with respect to this one, it begins with any interaction, any encounter has to be predicated on professionalism and respect. As opposed to jumping to conclusions, one should always proceed by asking questions. It's not a matter of the problem, oftentimes is a matter of the suspicions that are rife in the mind, right? And the latitude that is given with respect to how one acts on these suspicions, on these presumptions. So I would say the benefit of the doubt should always be given to the one who is approached, and that one needs to be cautious in an approach, but one should ask questions as opposed to operating on the basis of presumptions. And engaging in those conversations that Dr. Montgomery was referencing at the beginning. Those conversations are not just the conversations that take place at 7 p.m. on a Wednesday night. More often than not, they're the conversations that take place in those micro interactions between 2, 3, or 4 people. And those are the conversations that we need to concentrate on developing our skills and our practices and engaging in those conversations very respectfully and hopefully very constructively.
I would challenge that a little bit, Todd, if you can get into a discourse with me. So there's one scenario where that absolutely what you're saying can happen. What about in the heat of the moment where there's a perpetrator and the law is in pursuit, or something more heightened and there's judgment that has to be made? Would the same principles apply? Question.
Well, what I would say is that oftentimes people jump to the moment, but what's more important than the moment is the preparation that one has to be entering into such moments. If there's a lack of preparation, if there's a lack of running of scenarios, if there's a lack of building connections within communities, then the judgments that one is making under duress and stress are more often than not going to be excessive judgments or erroneous judgments that could have been otherwise had preparation been in place. So what we're talking about, particularly with the activities that are being pursued by those who are involved in this project, is how do we put in place the preparations such that when those situations, which are situations that will inevitably arise, people are making conscientious, correct, and safe decisions that are to the benefit of everyone involved, as opposed to the detriment of those who are under suspicion.
Yeah, I appreciate that. If I can echo, Ralph, the notion that preparation needs to be there, but preparation has to be swift in light of the propaganda machine, right? Because on the one hand, you see things play out in the media that speaks ill truth to a certain population of people, that feeds a narrative that informs that lack of preparation, brings it to the rush of judgment, and therein lies some of the conflicts and the tensions that we see today.
The only thing I'll add succinctly is to build on what Dr. Tichenor said. You know, the word preparation is a value system, isn't it? Preparation means one thing and it means another to somebody else. Preparation means one thing to people of color. It can mean something totally different to law enforcement.
From a point of process, how does it, the term to me that comes to mind immediately is de-escalation.
Certainly.
It's in Dr. Baird, the heat of the moment. And I think it's so important, if I may add, to de-escalate a situation so that people can listen to each other as a main priority. Yes?
Certainly agree.
Yes.
Yes, yes.
We're going to be breaking in just about 2 minutes to listen to some incredible music from Doc Woods. And then our TV audience will be leaving us. We thank you so much for being part of this tonight. We want you to come back next week on WPNY at 7 o'clock next Wednesday. If anyone wants to participate in the conversation, don't hesitate instead to come on the internet at communityforjustice.org. And then you can also ask questions such as the ones that I'm repeating for our panelists tonight. The folks who are on the internet with us, please stay on with us because we are going to be going with Q&A right up until 8:30, okay? And again, the folks who are on WPNY, thank you so much for being with us, and come back next week and tell your friends about what you watched. Okay, I think we should probably go to Doc Woods. Is that I'm just doing the timing here a little bit. All right. Doc Woods of Hamilton College has provided some music for us of his own creation. And I will tell you, if you haven't heard him, he is amazing. We love him. And he has public concerts every so often up in Hamilton too.
Going to unmute.
There we go.
Can everybody hear? Can everybody see me?
Yes.
Yes, you can physically see me?
Yes, Doc.
Okay. So now I was asked to participate in this way to add to or enhance the statements that are being made, particularly with an overall scope of the term Black Lives Matters. And so I was asked to say something about music. So in my teaching of my African American popular music class, which I've taught now for Hamilton College now for 28 years, I found two things to be essential to the musical expressions of people of color, particularly African American people. And that is the oldest two expressions of African American popular music is the blues and various forms of gospel music, starting with spirituals. So what happens with that is this, is as people of color have to consistently deal with laws and protocols that they know from the very beginning are unfair and are damaging and are causing tremendous pain to the human psyche, then a set of skills has to be developed to cope with that. And so the blues is an awesome, awesome expression because you don't play the blues because you believe the blues. You play the blues to beat the blues. And so what happens is there's two messages. The first message is in the lyrics that actually tell you what the song is about. And then usually there's a guitar player or a horn player or somebody, usually guitar, and he takes a solo. So now, when he takes his solo, even though the lyrics might be sad or they might be angry, but the guitar playing in between the lyrics is absolutely fiery and authoritative and powerful and oftentimes quite joyous. And if there's people at that Saturday night function, they usually go home snapping their fingers, tapping their feet, and haven't had a good time. And the blues turns around and says, they did it to me again. I come with all these terribly sad lyrics and everybody leaves happy. How did they do that? And so you take what is out there and you quote unquote keep it real. And then you turn that on its head by saying in so many words, okay, if I can find a way to create what I think the sound of my psychic pain is and play it outside my ears, I can vent pain from the psyche. We're going to hear right now from one of the young, incredibly talented blues players. His name is Kingfish, and he's going to be playing a song called That Ain't Right. Now, basically in this song, he's talking about his woman ain't treating him right, but the woman could stand for fate itself not treating him right. Let's look at our lyrics and listen to Kingfish perform.
You like a queen. When you don't get your way, you get down mean. It ain't right. I give you all you want, treat you like a queen. When you don't get your way, you get down mean. It ain't right. That ain't no way to act. I said you should be ashamed, treating me like that. First time I met you, baby, you purr like a kitty cat. Now I feel them claws scratching down my back. It ain't right. That ain't no way to act. I said you should be ashamed, treating me like that. You gotta chill. I said I'd never leave you, but sometimes I think I will. It ain't right. There ain't no way to act. I said you should be ashamed, treating me like that. Treating me like that.
You play the blues to beat the blues. You play the blues to beat the blues.
Much, Doc. That was wonderful. We really appreciate that. We're into our Q&A session for our internet audience. We thank you. We have well over 100 people, I believe, still enrolled right now in this program from around our community. So thank you for being part of this. We're going to get right back into some questions. Two people have already asked questions about redlining to get a little bit more specific, and how redlining has played out in our local area. I don't know if people have comments about that or the effects of it. I know that Professor Tichenor already referred to that to a degree. Do you want to pick up on that at all or explain a little more about it locally?
I actually don't have data locally about how that's played out, so I don't know if someone else does and wants to jump in with that. I can tell you what it's done on the national level.
Well, let's talk a little more about that anyway, because
Okay.
our effects are, not that unique to one community.
Right, absolutely. So the combination of redlining and the original Federal Housing Authority Act that was passed in 1934 meant that families of color, particularly Black families, were not able to move out of urban areas as they began to deteriorate moving through the 20th century. And it wasn't just that they couldn't get mortgages to move into the suburbs as white families were doing, but they also were barred from getting loans to fix up the housing stock that they were in. So it contributed to the devaluation of their property. And we know that property taxes are linked to school funding, so it has an impact on the quality of education that folks were able to access. The other thing we know is that businesses moved out of cities over the course of the 20th century. And as their taxes were lost, the funding for services in general in urban areas declined. And so that's led to sort of this downward cycle of disinvestment in our urban areas, and explains a lot of why Black families in particular have been concentrated in these areas, because they have not had access to the financial support, the means to move out in the way that white families have.
Thank you. That's helpful. I have an experience from Oneida County. It's not redlining per se, but it's a federal policy that was enacted while I was county executive, which was, by the way, almost 20 years ago. HUD said they wanted to stop having people concentrated in projects, housing projects. And so Washington Courts was torn down behind the auditorium in Utica. And instead substituted was housing that was supposed to be in one or two or so forth, low number of units per house or per building, usually like one or two family houses and that sort of thing. Very interesting, great idea, until you realized, as this unfolded, that the housing was purchased where it was cheapest to buy, I think, was a big part of it, or perhaps where least resistance would be had. So housing was mostly built in Cornhill. I really didn't see that was what was supposed to happen there, and I objected to that. Not that had a great impact, I'm afraid. But, I mean, these are the kinds of things that can happen, and it's sad. Anyway, anybody else with any comments there?
Yeah.
I would say it is sad, but intentionality plays a strong role in the decisions that are being made. This is why the power to vote to determine who is best suited to lead based on their pedigree and their past experiences gives the single citizen the power to have affect. And the extent to which we continue to play with the voting rights and the ballot boxes, it's another way to intimidate or to stymie or to stop or to prevent or ultimately to take away that singular power that a citizen would have to make that decision. So it's the collective we that can change the consciousness of citizen that might lead, right? So somebody's leading for the people, by the people, the extent to which the people don't have a voice, that's a tyranny. That's a dictatorship. And so we have to figure out ways to make sure that people are being empowered to vote and that there's a watchdog to make sure that what is in fact for the people is in fact for the people. And so it is sad, but some of these things happen under the watch of people who are in power, who are good intended, but somehow get dwarfed and turned around and take their eye off the prize.
Let me ask when you, Doctor, about people who don't have a voice. And I guess one of the questions I have is, how do we best empower people who think they don't have a voice to actually start speaking up and then find that they do? And one of the ways I see that is, I've seen this with the examples of folks that want to build not-for-profit agencies, services, drug services, or other programs to help people with different disabilities or illnesses or what have you. And how they get built in certain neighborhoods because those neighborhoods don't object, whereas other ones raise a furor about it. I'm not looking to get everybody else to object. I would prefer, I guess one of the questions is, how do we try to get it so people don't object? But the other question is, how do we make sure people who are in neighborhoods in the inner cities in particular feel that they do have that voice if they want to speak up about what to do to protect their neighborhood? Not against that, but in general, or to look out for the quality of their neighborhood.
I'll let Dr. Montgomery take a stab at it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, I was just going to, first of all, just circle back real quick to the consequences of redlining, because it's going to partially answer your question. What redlining is, or what isolating people to areas where people probably should not live.
Mm-hmm.
The consequence of that is a concept called learned helplessness. If you don't know what that is, go to the zoo. Animals don't try to escape from the zoo. They've learned, why bother? Nothing's going to happen. That's what institutional and systemic racism does. It puts people in these constructs called social cages. Sometimes it's in neighborhoods, sometimes it's in areas where for decades and for generations, they have not seen inspiration. They have not seen someone who looks like them, who has made it or is respected. Therefore, why go outside? Why try? So part of the things that I alluded to was people have to be shown a realistic path. And they have to see the outcomes. We can talk about the outcomes. We can talk about autonomy, but unless people see it, they tend to walk very slowly. I liken this, I'll just end here. I liken this, I'm from the country, so if you see a pasture full of cows and they come across a section of the wires that are down, the cows will sit and stare at it. And it takes a long time before one has the courage to take the step through that gap, because they have been conditioned. Why bother? We might as well just sit here. So people have to be inspired through action, through a realistic vehicle for success, modeling, and they have to see that someone else and others have taken that step through that gap and has had a result in some kind of positive social change and personal success.
Thank you. I'm going to read a long question that I really can't find any way to summarize. How does a community, especially such as ours here, work toward fixing systemic racism and being inclusive of the many generational effects and facets of systemic racism? The person says, I feel that the being narrow and focused may be an easier way to gain traction, identifying a specific narrow thing to fight, but it leaves too many people facing injustice. And more, where other people may think that while encompassing the whole thing may become so broad, it becomes diffuse and ineffective.
One thing I would say to the question and response, one of the keys is coalition. You can't do everything. No individual can. no small collectivity can. But if you build coalitions between those who have certain interests and you share resources, and one of the most important things to share is encouragement, because the struggle to make such changes are long and arduous. But that community of coalition, I think, is what's going to be key to make changes. Certain folks will focus in on certain issues, certain folks will focus in on others. But the more you can coordinate those efforts and the more you can lend mutual support to those efforts, the more we can make progress on multiple fronts.
Super, thank you. Anyone else want to
I
add?
just, yeah, I keep thinking about conundrum of the dialectic, and I agree with Brother Todd that there's power in the coalition, but I believe you have to affect change from where you sit, and you must start with self, and be an example to that change that you want to see, and then you adopt others who might be aligned. Look for alignment with others who are moving towards that same goal that you're having. But then you also got to remember that when you're trying to bring people along, we're on different sides of the continuum and it takes time. And so for every action is an equal reaction, right? So that if you're learning, having learned helplessness, you have to unlearn that learned helplessness to become empowered and inspired. And someone has to be blowing expectancy and positivity and hope and give you that example. There's so many things that comes when you're raising a child in a certain environment and determining what is the curriculum that you want for the outcome, but you have to have a vision of what that outcome is and then work backwards from there. Well, if you're coming from broken homes, mom and dad are at work, poverty is running rampant, you can't find a job, all these things that are debilitating is what I said, the making of a slave mentality still permeates our society today. So there's a lot of unlearning that has to be had. And it's not just for those who were colonized. The colonizers need to be learned what was done before. So there's a lot of re-education that needs to be done. And I think we have to rebuild our educational system with transparency and fervor so that we can get confidence in there, because there's students that are saying, I'm not going to school. Well, today we can't go to school because of COVID, but people are dropping out of institutions that they no longer have confidence in.
I think another big piece of that coalition building is that those of us who identify as white have to really step up. I mean, one of the things that has been heard a lot this summer, particularly in the protests that were sparked by the killing of George Floyd, were things like, whites built the system, they have to be part of the dismantling of the system. And I think that for, again, those of us who identify as white and want to be part of the solution to the problem, one of the obstacles can be being afraid to step up and make a mistake and be labeled a racist, right? To say the wrong thing, to do the wrong thing, which, I talk to my students about this in my classes, and when we first start talking about race, I talk about the emotions around race and who might be feeling what. And after we had that discussion, I always say to them, I know that particularly those who identify as white are really afraid of being called a racist, because that's a really bad thing, right? That's something no one wants to be tagged with. And I say, I'm gonna let you off the hook just a little bit, because guess what? You are all racists. It is impossible not to be racist if you are raised in a culture that's permeated with systemic racism. And so once you accept that fact, that particularly as a white person, you know very little perhaps about the experience of people of color, very little about the history, as Dr. Barrett has said, because our schools don't always do us any favors in that regard. Be willing to step up and to make mistakes, right? And to work with people of color, not to try to take over the agenda and to set the agenda for change necessarily, but to be active allies, right? Ally is a verb rather than a noun, and be willing to learn as you go, because it can be very uncomfortable to feel like you don't have all the answers. And we have to be able to work in that discomfort.
Ronni,
The only thing I'd like to add to that is, I'm sorry, the only thing I wanted to add to that is, a big part of the conversation I perceive is the humanization of the pain, the depth of pain that we as a culture of people of African American descent have experienced. Part of the conversations need to be a real deep conversation about what those scars look like, what they feel like. What is it like no matter where you go, no matter where you travel, those scars go with you. And I perceive that a lot of those scars are not discussed, they're not reviewed. So to answer your question, Ralph, people who are outside of those cultures, people who perceive their voices are not being heard, part of that is going to need to be a validation of what that scar is, and those scars are. It's not just about we've had enough. It's also about we haven't heard enough.
I would add.
Ralph, one thing I would, I'm sorry, please go ahead, Ed.
No,
Please.
Todd, go ahead. Go ahead, please.
The one thing I would add is I want to be careful about sort of falling into some notion of a culture of pathology. There is certainly agency, vibrant in a whole host of ways, and there's certainly been clamor for a whole host of changes. Unfortunately, the voices often get drowned out and ignored, and that could give rise to a certain resignation, that is for sure. But if you look closely in communities, you will always find resilience. And the key is not to presume that there is an absence of agency, but to go into communities and do what's best to strive to amplify that agency.
So what I wouldn't want to do, I'm going to make it really basic. If I'm living in a neighborhood that is impoverished and needs to come up, and the extent to which that my acuities, and I'm aware, I have hypervigilance around my plight and where I might want to go and be. All I'm asking is the extent to which I come to any door where I'm effectuating change for what it is that I need and want. There's no barriers to my entry. There's no barriers to my access, right? Because I'm not going to blame white people for 400 years and guilt them into a system that they're only benefiting from. The extent to which they benefit, I want you to leverage your privilege to help me get to next door, to the extent that I'm, one, asking for it, two, you're willing to offer it, and I see value in you giving it. And so I don't know that someone is coming into the hood to say, let me give you a hand and let me help you out. However, if I'm going to school and I'm doing my homework, I'm coming to class, everything that I'm doing to move forward, don't be a barrier to my entry. Do not stand in my way. And if we can have that mindset, because we're not going to change 400 years, we can learn from it. It's going to inform where we're headed. I'm not going to let my circumstances define me. I'm going to let it inform me, right? And so it goes back to something we talked about, Mark. Where do you get that empowerment from to take ownership for the change that you want to see? Don't trip me up, right? Don't stand in my way. Opportunity means no barriers, more access. And so we could break down some of those walls, and when we tell our people, because we be the example of that change they want to see, be that example of success, then no barrier should be there when they're coming, because we're coming. And that's all I'm asking for.
Yeah.
Can
Show me
I-
that you mean it.
To ask, as we get close to the end of our time, I would love to focus us on the workshops to come here, the discussions to come. We've had a great discussion. I want to thank you all so much, all our panelists and our questioners, for a very, very fascinating and important discussion of racism. How, and we've had really a couple of examples, not a lot, of how a better understanding of institutional and systemic racism can help us to do, and this is a better job of becoming a fair and safe community. In other words, how we apply this to the criminal justice system for the benefit of everybody. How do we apply understandings? How do we make these understandings become tools, if you will, to getting to a fairer and safer community for everyone? I'll give you one example that I think is fair to say. You tell me if I'm wrong. But if more people feel empowered to feel that they can make a difference in the quality of their neighborhood, they may be more likely to report a crime. Am I wrong?
I think we have to look at, it's about education, it's about knowledge. We say education and knowledge is power. It's only potential power. You know, it's what do you do with it now that you have it? When working in higher education, I'm about what do my students know and what do they know to do? They need to be able to demonstrate that what they've learned is applicable somewhere. And there's a shift and a change by their agency. And so what we can begin to do, take the numbers that we're sharing with you where there are disparities and set a personal goal. If you're owning an organization, if you're a manager, if you're a director, if you're a vice president, you look at those numbers and set a goal and ask yourself, what are some of the key performance indicators that I need to respond to and move that needle, right? So if you're sitting in a position of power, when we talk about institutional, systemic, and structural racism, we know what it is, right? So to me, don't just get the knowledge, use the knowledge to bring about the change that we're saying we want to see. Be that example of that change, because what I just said is, don't be a barrier to my entry. So if I'm bringing young Black men and young Black women and Latinos and all those who've been historically disenfranchised, and I'm saying they're coming with me, I've managed to be an example and a role model for them to come with me. When we come, that door should be open.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I want to follow up on this and address the issue you're raising, Ralph, at least hopefully address the issue you're raising. It's troubling the way you framed it. Okay. The idea of what's going to be necessary for the citizens within community to actually report what is necessary so as to be able to facilitate the work of those in law enforcement. And that's putting an onus and responsibility on citizens for a breakdown in terms of relation and process that I think in many ways is quite offensive. Because if you step back and take into account the forces at play bearing down upon these communities, whether they be social or economic, and certainly economic, and if you begin to address those forces and transform the nature of community such that it is a vibrant community in which people are able to forge bonds of trust with one another and with those who are serving them and their interests in those communities, then you'll have different realities. But when people are hungry, they are struggling, and they are viciously stereotyped and violently assaulted, the bonds of trust are going to be absent. And it is not to be laid at the feet of those who are suffering under those systemic conditions.
Correct.
That's really well put, and I'm going to build upon that by saying a couple things. Also, to respond to what you said, Ralph, the concerns have to be acknowledged first. You have to acknowledge that these problems exist. And on top of that, the recognition that people who are suffering, they don't want your sympathy. They want your empathetic lens. If you're talking about, I'm very fortunate, I sit on the police reform committee. And one of the things that I hear quite often in defense of violence against people of color, well, why don't you come through and go through a simulator perhaps so you can see what we see? Well, I'm going to say, you need to go through a simulator of ours so you can see what we see as part of that process too. Elvis Presley wrote a song called Walk a Mile in My Shoes that has a lot of relevance moving forward.
Fine. We can all learn. I'm learning. I'm listening. Anyone else with comments on these? Or anybody want to finish up with any point that they would like to make before we close this, because we're only a few minutes away?
Ralph, can I say something?
Doc, please.
Yeah. Okay, so now I'm going to undo my video. Let's see. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, so now what I'm going to say is this, is when, like you said, if I'm trying to make something out of myself, I'm working as hard as I can. I'm using every resource that I know through which I can better myself. And I'm bringing Black and brown men and women with me, and especially young people, by which I'm trying to afford them a highly motivated and aggressive example. Then what you must not do, you must not block my path. Now that has been stated in a way that's very, very stated eloquently. But here's what the situation is. If you want to know how I feel, if you want to know how I think, if you want to know how I would like to contribute and what I'm capable of, you must afford me a solemn promise, even a pledge, even an oath, that when you find out how talented I am and how aggressive I am toward trying to make the best I can out of myself, that you don't go into fear mode. You cannot go into fear mode and then find secret ways of preventing me from coming to my potential. And see, nobody wants to talk about the secrets involved in racism. The stuff that's done behind the scenes, which is adding a very cowardly aspect to racism. And that is, not only is it dark, it's bordering on demonic. And all that secret stuff. And that goes right back to all that Willie Lynch stuff. All those secret little sneaky ways that you have of defaming people and tearing down their character and creating an atmosphere of learned helplessness. That's all part of it. And all that secret stuff has got to be done away with if there's going to be anything approximating honesty and fairness. And trust is at a premium. And I will say this, as a Black man, I've been wounded so many times that once you lose my trust due to doing something sneaky, you have desperately little chance of ever regaining it.
On that note, I think those are, folks, I can't thank you all enough, to all of our contributors tonight. It's been a very illuminating conversation. It's been a very meaningful conversation. And as I said at the beginning, this gives us the opportunity to understand better the questions that we're going to go into in the weeks to come of specific areas of policing, courts, jail, and so forth. So we can understand some of the background that we need to understand in order to deal with these questions. I thank you all very much. I thank all of our listeners and our participants. Please come back next week, join us, and encourage your friends to sign on, register, and be part of our program. And have a great night, everyone. Thank you all so much.